The Battle of Mukden began on February 20th, 1905, across a 90-mile front in Manchuria. Two massive armies faced each other in sub-zero temperatures. Russia had committed 300,000 soldiers under General Alexei Kuropatkin. Japan had deployed 270,000 under General Oyama Iwao. By every conventional measure, this should have been a grinding war of attrition between roughly matched forces. Instead, what unfolded over the next 18 days would quietly dismantle every assumption the military world had built around artillery warfare. The guns never showed themselves. Japanese forward observers had been positioned on elevated peaks across the terrain, each equipped with telescopes and field telephones. They could see the Russian lines. The artillery batteries could not. The guns were stationed miles behind the front, completely hidden from enemy view, firing solely on the basis of mathematical calculations, transmitted through telephone wire. No direct line of sight, no exposed position, no visible target, just numbers, angles, and elevation data fed through a wire, and then destruction delivered from a location the enemy could not locate, could not counter, and could not silence. Russian artillery crews were trained to identify and suppress enemy gun positions. That doctrine became useless in a single campaign. They returned fire at coordinates that held nothing. Their shells landed in empty fields while Japanese batteries continued firing from concealed positions with uninterrupted precision. The Russians lost 90,000 men. Japan sustained 70,000 casualties. But the true damage to Russia was not measured in bodies. It was measured in command collapse, supply failure, and the psychological unraveling of an army that could not fight what it could not find. What makes Mukden deeply unsettling is not the scale of the defeat. It is what happened afterward. The United States had military observers present throughout the Russo-Japanese War. They watched the indirect fire system work in real time. They filed detailed reports. They returned home with documentation of a method that had rendered traditional artillery doctrine obsolete. And yet the United States Army did not formally integrate indirect fire tactics until the First World War, more than a decade later. Declassified documents from that period suggest the delay was not accidental. There were internal concerns about the source of Japan's tactical sophistication and quiet fears that the information had reached Japanese commanders through channels that were never meant to be shared. Espionage was suspected. Nothing was ever confirmed. The 1905 revolution that tore through Russia in the months following Mukden was not coincidental. Military humiliation at that scale destabilized the political foundation of the Tsarist regime. The same tactics Japan refined in Manchuria shaped General Pershing's approach in France 13 years later. Military analysts writing in 2024 have drawn a direct structural line from Mukden's hidden batteries to modern drone-assisted strike systems where the weapon and the targeting eye are separated by miles, and the target never sees what kills it. The guns at Mukden never appeared on the horizon. That was precisely the point. The Battle of Cannae took place on August 2nd, 216 BCE, on a flat, dusty plain in southeastern Italy near the Aufidus River. Rome had assembled the largest army in its history to that point, 86,000 soldiers under consuls Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, confident in their numerical superiority, certain that sheer mass would crush the Carthaginian force opposing them. Hannibal Barca had 50,000 men. He was outnumbered by nearly 2-1. He chose to attack anyway. What he engineered in the hours that followed has never been fully replicated, and military institutions have spent 2,000 years trying to understand exactly how he did it. Hannibal arranged his infantry in a deliberate convex arc, bulging forward toward the Roman lines. His weakest troops, the Gauls and Spanish infantry, occupied the center. His strongest African veterans were positioned on both flanks. The Romans saw exactly what they expected to see, a vulnerable center inviting pressure. Varro ordered the advance, concentrating his massive infantry force directly into the middle of the Carthaginian line. The Romans pushed. The Carthaginian center bent. Then it bent further. What felt like a breakthrough was a mechanism being loaded. As the Roman mass poured inward, chasing what appeared to be a collapsing center, the arc inverted. The flanks held. The African veterans on both sides pivoted inward. Carthaginian cavalry, having already routed the Roman horsemen on the wings, swung behind the Roman formation and sealed the rear. 86,000 soldiers were now surrounded on all sides, compressed into a space so dense that men could not raise their sword arms. They were not fighting, they were suffocating inside a human seal. 70,000 Romans died within hours. Contemporary accounts describe the killing as mechanical rather than combative. Men were simply processed. Military historians writing in 2025, reconstructing the battle's geometry, have described the final phase as a compression trap with no tactical equivalent in ancient warfare. What remains unresolved is what Hannibal did not do. He did not march on Rome. His cavalry commander, Maharbal, reportedly told him directly that if he allowed immediate pursuit, Hannibal would dine in Rome within 5 days. Hannibal refused. No surviving Punic record explains the decision with clarity. The records that might have illuminated his reasoning were destroyed along with Carthage in 146 BC. Military scholars have debated for centuries whether it was logistical caution, political calculation, or a fundamental misreading of Rome's psychological resilience. The answer has never surfaced. Rome recovered. It took years, but it recovered. Hannibal's tactical perfection at Cannae did not end the war he came to fight. What it did instead was enter the permanent curriculum of military education. Norman Schwarzkopf cited the double envelopment principle directly when designing the Gulf War's ground campaign in 1991. West Point instructs approximately 4,000 cadets annually using Cannae as the foundational model for encirclement doctrine. The most devastating tactical victory in ancient history did not win the war. That contradiction has never been satisfactorily explained. The Battle of Austerlitz occurred on December 2, 1805, in the Moravian countryside near the town of Austerlitz. Napoleon Bonaparte commanded 73,000 French soldiers. Facing him was a combined Russian and Austrian force of 85,000 men under Tsar Alexander the Great and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II. On paper, the French were outnumbered and strategically overextended. Napoleon had been campaigning for months. His supply lines were strained. His army was tired. The Allied commanders looked at the map, looked at the numbers, and concluded that what they were seeing was a French force on the edge of collapse. That conclusion was precisely what Napoleon needed them to reach. In the days before the battle, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank. He thinned the line visibly, repositioned troops in ways that Allied observers could detect, and allowed intelligence to filter through, suggesting his southern position was vulnerable and undermanned. He even requested an armistice meeting with Tsar Alexander, projecting hesitation and diplomatic anxiety. The Allied command interpreted every signal exactly as intended. The plan was set. They would strike the weakened French right, roll up the flank, cut Napoleon's retreat, and end the campaign in a single decisive blow. On the morning of December the 2nd, a thick fog blanketed the Pratzen Heights at the center of the battlefield. The Allied army began its movement south toward the French right, exactly as Napoleon had anticipated. As their center thinned and their columns descended from the heights, the fog began to lift. At the precise moment the Allied center was most exposed, the sun broke through the mist. French troops, who had been briefed to watch for exactly this signal, began their assault of the Pratzen Heights immediately. The Allied center was struck while its strongest forces were marching in the wrong direction. Military historians and computational simulations conducted in 2024 have examined whether the timing of the fog's clearing was incorporated into Napoleon's planning or whether it was meteorological fortune that hardened into legend. The sun breaking on the anniversary of his coronation, at the exact moment his attack required visibility, became mythologized as the Sun of Austerlitz. What the simulations cannot resolve is how Napoleon could have known. Missing Austrian dispatch records from the days preceding the battle have fueled persistent theories that French intelligence had penetrated Allied communications, and that the attack timing was not reactive to weather, but pre-coordinated around a predicted window. Those dispatches have never been recovered. 2,000 Allied soldiers drowned when French artillery shattered the frozen ponds of Sachin during the retreat. The battle ended the Third Coalition within hours. 6 weeks later, the Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had existed in various forms for over 1,000 years, formally dissolved. Francis II abdicated his imperial title. The map of Europe was redrawn. Ulysses S. Grant's deceptive troop movements during the Vicksburg Campaign in 1863 were later analyzed by military historians as structurally consistent with Austerlitz's principles. More than 200 American military academies currently include Austerlitz in their core tactical curriculum. The Allied commanders never understood what had happened until it was already over. The Battle of Gaugamela took place on October 1st, 331 BCE, on a wide, deliberately flattened plain near the village of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. Darius III had chosen the ground himself. He had ordered the terrain leveled in advance to give his scythe chariots unobstructed running room and to nullify the Macedonian advantage in flexible infantry movement. His force numbered over 100,000 by conservative estimates, with some ancient sources placing the figure considerably higher. Alexander the Great arrived with 47,000 Macedonians. Darius had prepared the battlefield. He had selected the location. He had more men, more chariots, and more cavalry. Every structural advantage belonged to Persia. Alexander studied the Persian line the night before the engagement and refused to attack at night. Despite pressure from his commanders, Parmenion suggested a surprise assault under darkness. Alexander reportedly responded that he would not steal a victory. Military historians have long debated whether that statement reflected genuine confidence or deliberate psychological positioning designed to reach Darius through informants. No conclusive answer exists. On the morning of October 1st, Alexander deployed his forces along an oblique axis, deliberately angling his line rather than presenting a conventional parallel front. As the battle opened, he began drifting his cavalry rightward, drawing Persian units laterally to match his movement and prevent an outflanking maneuver. The Persian line stretched and shifted to cover him. That lateral movement was the mechanism. As the Persian left extended to track Alexander's drift, a gap opened near the center of Darius's formation. It was not large, and it did not remain open long. Alexander had been watching for exactly that moment. He turned the companion cavalry directly into the gap and drove toward Darius himself. The assault was not a broad envelopment. It was a single concentrated penetration aimed at collapsing Persian command cohesion by threatening its highest point. Darius fled. The moment his chariot turned from the field, the Persian formation began disintegrating from the center outward. His family, his treasury, and his royal camp were captured. The scythe chariots Darius had invested heavily in proved almost entirely ineffective. Archaeological excavations conducted in 2023 near the Gaugamela site uncovered chariot wheel components and scythe blade fragments consistent with Persian military equipment of the period. Analysis of the metallurgy and deployment patterns indicated the chariots were funneled into prepared Macedonian gaps and neutralized before reaching the main infantry line. Darius had built his battle plan around a weapon that Alexander had already developed a counter for. Why Persian command continued relying on chariot tactics, despite mounting evidence of their vulnerability across multiple prior engagements, remains one of the unresolved questions of the campaign. Alexander's own account of his pre-battle confidence, including reported visions of victory, was extensively promoted through court historians. Whether those accounts reflected genuine psychological certainty or calculated propaganda designed to solidify troop morale cannot be verified. George Patton studied Alexander's flanking methodology explicitly. Modern military simulation platforms incorporating Gaugamela scenarios have logged over 1 million user engagements, making it among the most reconstructed ancient battles in digital wargaming history. Darius never recovered his empire. The oblique line had opened a door, and Alexander had walked through it before anyone could close it. The Battle of Leuctra occurred in July 371 BCE on a flat agricultural plain in Boeotia, central Greece. The Spartan army had arrived with approximately 10,000 soldiers, including a corps of Spartiates, the professional warrior class that had dominated Greek military affairs for over a century. Epaminondas commanded 6,000 Thebans. By every conventional measure of the period, this should not have been a competitive engagement. Sparta had not lost a major land battle in living memory. Their phalanx formations, their discipline, and their cultural identity were built entirely around the presumption of battlefield invincibility. Greek city-states had organized their foreign policy, their alliances, and their survival calculations around that presumption for generations. Epaminondas understood that presumption better than anyone, and he had spent years designing a method to destroy it. The standard Greek phalanx deployed infantry in formations 8 to 12 men, deep across a relatively even front. Both sides would advance, shields locked, and the engagement would resolve through pushing pressure and attrition along the entire line. Epaminondas rejected that model entirely. On the left flank of his formation, directly opposite the Spartan elite, he massed his infantry 50 men deep, a column of extraordinary density concentrated at the single point where the battle's psychological outcome would be decided. The rest of his line was deliberately held back at an angle, refused from engagement, denying the Spartans the ability to use their numerical advantage across the broader front, while the critical strike was delivered. The Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite unit of 150 paired soldiers, bound by personal loyalty and trained to function as a cohesive shock force, was positioned at the leading edge of that deep column. They struck the Spartan right with a concentrated mass that the standard Spartan formation had no structural answer for. King Cleombrotus III was killed in the initial assault. The Spartan line did not bend, it fractured. The psychological architecture of Spartan invincibility collapsed in a single afternoon. Computational models developed in 2024 reconstructing the Leuctra engagement have demonstrated that the oblique refusal of Epaminondas' right wing created genuine tactical confusion in Spartan command. Officers trained to respond to parallel front engagements were presented with an asymmetric geometry they had no established doctrine to counter. What remains unresolved is why Spartan commanders, who had intelligence on Theban training methods and had observed Epaminondas' tactical thinking develop over years, made no adaptive adjustments to their formation depth or response protocols. Lost texts from the period, including Theban records that would have detailed the Sacred Band's specific operational role in the assault, might have clarified whether Spartan command failure was doctrinal rigidity or active misjudgment. Those texts have not survived. Sparta never recovered its dominant position in Greek affairs. The battle accelerated the conditions that eventually drove the Greek city-states toward the unified structures Alexander would later inherit and weaponize. Military historians have drawn direct structural parallels between Epaminondas' concentrated asymmetric strike and William Sherman's Civil War doctrine of massing overwhelming force at a single decisive point rather than distributing pressure evenly. ROTC programs across the United States currently instruct approximately 300,000 students annually using Leuctra as a foundational case study in doctrinal disruption. The deepest phalanx in Greek history had ended the longest dominance in Greek history. It took one flank, one column, and one afternoon. The Battle of Agincourt took place on October 25, 1415, in a narrow corridor of freshly plowed farmland in northern France between the villages of Agincourt and Tramecourt. Henry V of England had approximately 6,000 soldiers, the overwhelming majority of them longbowmen. Exhausted after a grueling march from Harfleur, weakened by dysentery, and trapped between a superior French force and an impassable strategic position, the English faced a French army numbering somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000. This force was heavily concentrated with armored knights and men-at-arms, representing the finest equipped military force in continental Europe. French commanders looked at the disparity and saw an inevitable conclusion. They were correct about the outcome. They were entirely wrong about which side it favored. The terrain decided everything before a single arrow flew. The battlefield was flanked on both sides by dense woodland, compressing the French formation into a narrow front that neutralized their numerical advantage. The ground between the two armies had been recently plowed and soaked by overnight rain. When the French advance began, thousands of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms moved forward through ankle-deep mud that consumed energy with every step. A man wearing full-plate armor in 1415 carried between 40 and 60 pounds of steel on his body. Moving through churned, saturated soil in that weight was not a military advance. It was an exhausting struggle against the ground itself. Henry ordered his archers forward to optimum range and then held them in disciplined silence until the French committed fully to their advance. When the volleys began, the rate of fire was devastating. English longbowmen trained from childhood could release between 10 and 12 arrows per minute with accuracy. With approximately 5,000 archers operating simultaneously, the arrow density over the advancing French column was effectively uninterrupted. Archaeological excavations conducted in 2025 at the Agincourt site recovered arrowhead concentrations confirming the storm pattern historical accounts had described, with distribution evidence suggesting overlapping fields of fire coordinated across the English line rather than independent shooting. The French armor failed not because it was technically insufficient, but because the combination of mud, exhaustion, and arrow volume created conditions it was never engineered to survive. Visors were struck, horses collapsed onto their riders. Men who fell in full plate armor in deep mud could not independently rise. The advance became a compression of falling bodies that subsequent waves continued pushing into. French knights were dying from suffocation and crushing weight before English men-at-arms moved through the pile with short blades. 6,000 French soldiers died. English losses were approximately 400. The ratio remains one of the most asymmetric outcomes in medieval military history. What has never been fully resolved is the role attributed to weather and what French and English chroniclers on both sides described as providential intervention. The rain that saturated the ground the night before, the fog that limited French visibility during the advance, and the precise timing of the English attack have generated persistent theological framing in contemporary accounts that historical analysis cannot cleanly separate from documented fact. Henry V's victory strengthened English negotiating leverage across the remainder of the Hundred Years' War and directly shaped the Treaty of Troy in 1420. Military analysts have traced the doctrinal influence of mass-range fire at Agincourt through to Union rifle tactics at Gettysburg, where disciplined long-range volleys against advancing infantry echoed the same fundamental principle Henry's archers had demonstrated 4 centuries earlier. The mud did more work that morning than the swords ever did. The Battle of Blenheim took place on August 13, 1704, along the northern bank of the Danube River near the Bavarian village of Blenheim. The Duke of Marlborough commanded a combined Allied force of 52,000 English, Dutch, and Imperial troops, alongside Prince Eugene of Savoy. Facing them was a Franco-Bavarian army of approximately 56,000 under Marshal Tallard, positioned in what French command considered a strategically impregnable defensive arrangement. The Danube protected their southern flank. The village of Blenheim anchored their right. The village of Oberglau secured their center left. French commanders had assessed the terrain and concluded that a frontal assault across open ground against their prepared positions would be military suicide for any attacker. Marlborough had studied that assessment and decided to use it. The Allied advance began in the early morning hours with a crossing of the Nebel Stream, a marshy tributary running parallel to the French line. French observers watched the approach and reported it upward through command. What they described was a conventional frontal assault developing slowly across difficult ground. Tallard interpreted the movement as confirmation of his defensive advantage. He reinforced the village of Blenheim with an enormous concentration of elite French infantry, pulling some of his finest units away from the open center of his line to ensure the anchor point could not be taken. He was responding to exactly what Marlborough wanted him to see. The attacks on Blenheim village were real but deliberately structured to appear more threatening than they were. English and Allied infantry pressed against the village perimeter with enough aggression to hold Tallard's attention and justify his continued reinforcement of that position. Simultaneously, coordinated pressure was applied at Oberglau on the opposite flank. French command was managing 2 apparent emergencies at the extremities of their line, while their center quietly bled of strength. When Marlborough judged the French center sufficiently depleted, he committed his main cavalry and infantry force directly into it. The line that had looked formidable in the morning had been hollowed out by its own commander's defensive decisions. The French center broke within hours. Tallard himself was captured. The forces locked inside Blenheim village, the elite infantry Tallard had concentrated there to hold his anchor point, found themselves surrounded, cut off, and unable to effect the battle that had already been decided in the open ground they had vacated. Approximately 13,000 French and Bavarian soldiers surrendered in a single engagement, a number that stunned European military observers at the time. Tactical analyses published in 2023 examining Marlborough's river-crossing methodology confirmed that the Nebel approach had been deliberately timed and sequenced to exploit gaps in French reconnaissance coverage. Why French forward scouts failed to detect the scale and intent of the Allied maneuver before Tallard had already committed his reserves remains incompletely explained. Documentary evidence suggests Marlborough operated an intelligence network that had penetrated French command communications, but the specific mechanisms and sources of that network have never been fully documented. The spy architecture behind Blenheim remains one of the least examined operational mysteries of the early 18th century. Vienna was saved from French strategic encirclement. The War of the Spanish Succession shifted irreversibly in Allied favor. Military historians at West Point have analyzed Blenheim's coordinated feint and strike methodology as a direct conceptual predecessor to Washington's deceptive crossing tactics during the Trenton Campaign of 1776. Tallard had built an impregnable position. Marlborough had simply convinced him to dismantle it himself. The Battle of Chancellorsville occurred from May 1st through May 4th, 1863, in the dense Virginia wilderness near the crossroads town of Chancellorsville. Major General Joseph Hooker had assembled the Army of the Potomac into what he publicly described as the finest army on the planet. He had 130,000 Union soldiers, superior artillery, reliable supply lines, and a carefully constructed flanking plan that had already succeeded in positioning his force on Robert E. Lee's left and rear simultaneously. Hooker had maneuvered brilliantly in the opening phase. He held every structural advantage. Then he stopped moving and waited for Lee to respond. That decision to wait handed the battle to the wrong army. Lee faced Hooker with approximately 60,000 Confederate soldiers, fewer than half the Union strength. His supply situation was deteriorating. His army was physically worn from continuous campaigning. Conventional military logic in that position demanded a careful defensive withdrawal to preserve the force for future engagements. Lee rejected that logic entirely and made a decision that military historians have struggled to classify as either genius or recklessness without concluding it was both simultaneously. He divided his already outnumbered army a second time. Stonewall Jackson was detached with approximately 28,000 men on a 14-mile flanking march through the dense wilderness forest, moving completely around the Union right flank, while Lee held Hooker's attention with the remaining Confederate force. The movement took the entire day of May the 2nd. 14 miles of infantry, artillery, and supply wagons moving through narrow forest roads within theoretical detection range of a Union army more than twice their size. Digital terrain mapping conducted in 2024 using historical forest density data confirmed that the tree coverage along Jackson's route created genuine visual concealment from Union observation points, but also demonstrated how narrow the margin of detection failure actually was. Multiple Union cavalry reports flagged unusual Confederate movement during the march. Hooker received those reports and interpreted them as a retreat rather than a flanking maneuver. He did not investigate further. Jackson's force emerged from the forest at approximately 5:15 in the evening, directly onto the exposed Union right flank, held by the 11th Corps. The attack achieved complete surprise. Men were eating dinner when the assault began. The 11th Corps collapsed within hours, and the psychological shock of the flank's destruction paralyzed Hooker's command decision-making for the remainder of the battle. A commander who had seized the initiative brilliantly in the opening days surrendered it completely and never reclaimed it. What followed Jackson's tactical triumph became one of the American Civil War's most enduring mysteries. On the evening of May the 2nd, returning from a forward reconnaissance in the darkness, Jackson was shot by Confederate pickets who mistook his party for Union cavalry. He was struck 3 times. His left arm was amputated. 8 days later, he was dead from pneumonia. The circumstances of the friendly fire incident have been examined repeatedly across 160 years of scholarship without producing a fully satisfying account of why Confederate sentries in a known command corridor opened fire on an unconfirmed mounted group without proper challenge procedures. The operational logs from that night contain inconsistencies that have never been reconciled. Lee called Jackson's death the loss of his right arm. The assessment was not rhetorical. Chancellorsville was Lee's most tactically complete victory, achieved against an opponent with more than double his strength. But the army that won it was fundamentally diminished by what the victory cost. George Patton's World War II operational deception framework, particularly his use of feigned threats to freeze enemy decision-making while real movements developed elsewhere, reflected the same psychological architecture Lee had deployed in the Virginia wilderness. Chancellorsville drew over 1 million visitors to its National Park battlefield last year alone. Hooker had the better army. Lee had the better understanding of what fear does to a commander who stops moving. The Battle of Midway took place from June 4th through June 7th, 1942, in the central Pacific Ocean near the American naval base at Midway Atoll. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had committed the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled to a single operation: 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and over 250 carrier-based aircraft. The objective was straightforward: draw out and destroy the remaining American carrier force in the Pacific, eliminating the United States Navy as a strategic obstacle and securing Japanese dominance across the entire ocean theater. The plan was detailed, layered, and carefully sequenced. Yamamoto was confident. His carrier force had not lost an engagement since the war began. He did not know that the United States had already read his plan. Station Hypo, the naval intelligence unit operating out of Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had been working against the Japanese JN-25 naval code for months. By late May 1942, Rochefort's team had achieved sufficient penetration of Japanese communications to reconstruct the core operational framework of Yamamoto's Midway Plan, including the target designation, the approximate timing, and the composition of the attacking force. The intelligence was not complete. Significant portions of Japanese transmissions remained unbroken. But what Rochefort had was enough, and he understood exactly what it meant. Admiral Chester Nimitz made his decisions on the basis of that intelligence with a clarity that left no room for the caution his numerical disadvantage might otherwise have demanded. He had 3 operational carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, against Japan's 4. He positioned them northeast of Midway, outside the search patterns Japanese reconnaissance had been assigned to cover, and waited. Yamamoto's plan had allocated a seaplane reconnaissance sweep that would have detected the American carriers before the battle opened. That sweep was delayed by logistical complications Yamamoto was never informed about in time to adjust his operational posture. Japan's carriers began their attack on Midway Island on the morning of June 4th, fully believing the American fleet was not yet at sea. The first strike wave returned with reports that a second attack on the island's defenses was necessary. Japanese commanders began rearming their aircraft, switching from armor-piercing bombs designed for carrier strikes to high-explosive ordnance suited for land targets. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked on hangar decks during the transition. It was at that precise moment, with 4 Japanese carriers in the middle of a rearming operation, their flight decks crowded and their hangars filled with unsecured ordnance and aviation fuel, that American dive bombers arrived overhead. The attack lasted approximately 5 minutes. 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were fatally struck within that window. Hiryu launched a counterattack that severely damaged Yorktown before being found and destroyed later the same afternoon. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers were gone within 24 hours. Japan lost over 3,000 personnel and more than 200 experienced carrier aviators whose training could not be rapidly replaced. Declassified signals intelligence documents processed and released in 2025 have provided additional granularity on the specific decryption breakthroughs that enabled Nimitz's positioning. What those documents have also surfaced is a clearer picture of Japanese internal warnings that were raised and dismissed before the operation launched. Multiple Japanese intelligence officers had flagged indicators suggesting American code-breaking capability had compromised operational security. Those warnings were evaluated and set aside. The institutional confidence of an undefeated carrier force overrode the analytical concerns of intelligence personnel operating below command level. The Pacific War did not end at Midway, but the strategic trajectory that had been moving consistently in Japan's favor since December 1941 reversed permanently in those 5 minutes over the Central Pacific. Japan had built its campaign around the assumption of surprise. The Americans had stolen that assumption months before the battle began. The Battle of Salamis occurred in late September 480 BCE in the narrow strait between the Greek mainland and the island of Salamis, west of Athens. Xerxes of Persia had arrived with a force that ancient sources describe as the largest military expedition the ancient world had ever assembled. His navy numbered approximately 1,200 warships. The Greek allied fleet under Athenian Admiral Themistocles could field 370 triremes. Athens itself had already been evacuated and burned by Persian forces days earlier. The Acropolis was in ruins. The Greek political coalition was fracturing under the psychological pressure of continuous Persian advance. Several Allied commanders were openly advocating withdrawal to the Peloponnese to establish a final defensive line. The strategic situation for Greece was not desperate, it was nearly terminal. Themistocles understood that an open-water engagement against a fleet 3 times the size of his own would end the war immediately and permanently in Persia's favor. He also understood something about the Persian fleet that Xerxes apparently did not consider sufficiently. Size in a confined space becomes a liability rather than an advantage. The deception Themistocles executed to engineer the battle's location was among the most psychologically sophisticated maneuvers in ancient military history. He sent a trusted slave, Sisinus, across to the Persian fleet with a fabricated message claiming that the Greek commanders were divided, that several Allied contingents were planning to slip away during the night, and that a Persian attack at dawn would catch the fleet in the middle of a disorganized withdrawal. Xerxes received the message and ordered his fleet to move into position overnight, sealing both exits of the Salamis Strait to prevent the Greek escape his intelligence had warned him about. His admirals deployed their ships in the darkness, holding position through the night, exhausting their crews before a single engagement had been fought. At dawn, the Greek fleet was exactly where Themistocles needed it to be, facing a Persian force that had been maneuvering for hours in confined water and was now attempting to execute a coordinated advance through a channel too narrow for their numerical advantage to function. Persian ships could not deploy in their intended formations. Vessels crowded against each other. Coordination collapsed into congestion. Greek triremes, shorter and more maneuverable by design, operated in the confined channel with a structural advantage the open ocean would never have provided. They rammed, they withdrew, they rammed again. The Persian fleet could not bring its full strength to bear at any point in the engagement because the geography made full strength geometrically impossible. Approximately 300 Persian vessels were sunk or captured. Greek losses were dramatically lower. Xerxes watched the entire engagement from a throne positioned on the slopes of Mount Agelaos overlooking the strait. Ancient sources, including Aeschylus, who fought at Salamis, and Herodotus, described the Persian king observing the systematic destruction of his fleet from a fixed, elevated position, recording the names of commanders who performed well and those who did not. The psychological dimension of a supreme commander, watching his naval strategy disintegrate in real time from an observation throne, has generated persistent scholarly analysis. Whether his fixed position reflected supreme confidence, ceremonial obligation, or a command structure too rigid to adapt in real time remains debated. Underwater survey work conducted in 2023 near the Salamis Strait identified wrecked debris fields and hull fragments consistent with large-scale ancient naval engagement, with artifact distribution patterns confirming the chaotic, compressed nature of the Persian fleet destruction that historical accounts had described. The oracle at Delphi had told the Athenians before the invasion that wooden walls would save them. Themistocles had argued publicly that the prophecy referred to the fleet rather than physical fortifications. Whether that interpretation was genuine theological reasoning or deliberate political framing designed to prevent Athenian evacuation debates from paralyzing the naval strategy has never been resolved from surviving texts. Xerxes withdrew from Greece following Salamis. The invasion that had consumed years of Persian planning and resources was effectively ended by a single afternoon in a narrow strait. Greek democratic institutions, the philosophical and political frameworks that would eventually form the foundational architecture of Western governance, survived because one admiral understood that the size of an enemy's strength means nothing if you choose the ground where that strength cannot be used. The largest fleet in the ancient world was defeated by a message that was never meant to be true. If these stories of tactical brilliance and historical turning points have changed the way you view the maps of the past, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history that time tried to bury. Help us plant the seeds for the future. The next treasury of historical secrets will be open soon.